In this video, we're going to look at how users can upload files to Azure Blob Storage in a Django application. Now, Azure Storage gives us a scalable location to upload files of different types. And this is a serverless solution. We don't need to worry about managing storage, and we don't need to think about managing a file system. And we're going to see how to use the Django-storages package in order to upload files to Azure Storage and also to access already uploaded files from Azure Blob Storage. And we'll also see how this integrates with Django's FileField. And finally, we'll also see how to generate signed URLs. And these are URLs that expire after a given period of time. And this allows us to protect our resources from being shared online. And that can be important if these are private resources that should not be accessed on the internet. So by using signed URLs, we can limit the access to our Django application. Now, if you're enjoying this content, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. And consider buying a coffee for the channel if you're finding the content useful. Let's dive in. Now, the package that we're going to use in this video to send files from Django to Azure is this one here. It's called Django-storages. And this package provides a collection of custom storage backends for Django, including one for Azure, but also backends for Amazon S3, for DigitalOcean, and for Google Cloud Storage. So we're going to work with this package in this video. What I'm going to do at the moment is open up VS Code, and I have a very simple Django project open at the moment. And as you can see, we've created a custom user model that inherits from the abstract user. Now let's say in this application we want our users to be able to upload a file, and that should be saved to Azure Blob Storage and associated with the user that uploaded the file. And by using Azure Blob Storage, this has many benefits. You can reliably and resiliently store your user data in an Azure Blob Container without having to worry about the file system or backups and so on. So what we're going to do to start with is create a model in this application. I'm going to call the model file upload, and that's going to inherit from the standard models.model class in Django. Now we want this model to be able to link the file that was uploaded to a user. So we're going to create a user foreign key here. So that's going to be an instance of the foreign key field, and that's going to be linked to the user. And when the user is deleted, we want to cascade that delete. And of course, we also want to get a reference to the uploaded file. So let's create a new field here, and that's going to be an instance of the Django file field. Now this field takes an upload to parameter, and we're going to send these files to a particular location within our Azure Blob. So let's just call that uploads for now. And one last thing we might want to track is when the upload happens. So we'll create a new field called uploaded at, and that's going to be a datetime field with auto now add set to true. Now, if you're inheriting from abstract user and you have your own user model, let's go to settings.py and make sure you have this setting here. The auth user model should point to that user model class. So what I want to do now is go to the terminal, and we're going to run python manage.py make migrations. And notice that I'm in a Python virtual environment that has Django installed. So let's run that command, and that creates a new migration file for our new model called file upload. And then once we've done that, we can run migrate to make that change to the database. And that's going to add a table called file upload to the database. Now, one last thing to do in the setup is go to admin.py, and I'm going to paste a bit of code in here. We're going to import the file upload model, and we're going to register that with the Django admin. So now that we've done that, let's go to the documentation for Django-storages, and we're going to install this. So let's copy that command and go to the terminal, and I'm going to paste that in to install Django-storages into this virtual environment. Now, once that's installed, what we're going to do is go back to settings.py, and we're going to define a setting here that's going to tell Django that the storage backend we want to use is the Azure Blob Storage. Now, in order to do that, let's go to the documentation for Django-storages, and we're going to go to the section on Azure Storage. Now, as it says here in configuration and settings, in Django 4.2, we changed the way that file storage objects are configured. And it's now easier to independently configure storage backends and also to add additional ones. And that's because storages is now configured through a dictionary. And this is very similar to the Django databases setting. We have a default storage, and you can add as many different storage backends as you like. Now, to send our files to Azure, we're going to need this class here from Django-storages, and that's the Azure storage class. So let's just copy this block here, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that in at the bottom. And I'm going to remove the options for now. And in fact, let's add one option. I'm going to add a timeout, and we'll set that to 20, which is actually the default. And we can save this file now. And if we go back to the documentation, there's a section on the different settings we can use with the Azure storage backend. And one of them here is the timeout. And that is a global connection timeout when you're actually connecting to Azure. That's just an example of how we can set one of these settings, and we're going to set another one. And this is an important one. It's called expiration in seconds. So let's copy the name of that key and go back to this options dictionary. And I'm going to paste that in here, and we're going to set this equal to, let's say, 500 seconds for now. So basically, when we upload a file to Blob Storage, the URL that's generated when we try and access that file through Django, that URL is only going to be valid for the number of seconds that we put in here. And if we set this to none, then we must have public access enabled in order to look at that file. So we're going to see examples of that later on, but let's set this to 500 for now. Now, as well as the default storage backend being Azure Storage, what we're also going to do is add a second storage backend for our static files. And we're going to set that equal to just the static files storage in Django. We don't need to change that. We're only going to be working with user uploaded files here. But make sure you add this because Django is going to look for that as well. So we can now save settings.py, but there are a couple of extra settings that we need to add, but these are more sensitive settings. And we can get an example of that in the starter code. There is an env.example file, and it contains an Azure container, an Azure account name, and Azure account key. So we need to set the three of these based on what we actually add to Azure. The Azure container is basically going to be the container for storing our blobs. And then we have a storage account name in Azure. And the Azure account key is going to allow us to connect securely using a key that's specific to our storage account. Now we'll fill these values in the next section. So let's now move on and go to the Azure portal. I'm going to go back to the browser and I'm going to go to this portal here. So the first thing I want to do is create what's called a resource group, and you can see that here. And a resource group is essentially just a logical container for a group of services that are related in some way. So you can imagine for a Django application, you might create a resource group in order to put the server where the application is deployed, and also to put the Azure Blob Storage account where your files are going to be stored, and maybe you'll have a database and so on. So a resource group allows you to logically bundle those together. And imagine you're going to delete that entire service. If you bundle them together in a resource group, it becomes easy to just remove everything associated with that group. So I would recommend in Azure to just add things to the specific resource group that they belong. So we're going to create one of these now in Azure. So let's create a resource group, and we get this form here. And what I'm going to do is give this a name of Django-web app. Now you can select the region that's closest to you. I'm going to go to UK West, and then we can review and create this. We don't need to review it, we just need to create this. So let's hit the create button at the bottom. And at the top right, you can see the resource group has been created. So now that that's done, what we can do is we can create a storage account that's part of this resource group. So let's go to the search bar at the top, and one of the recent services for me is storage accounts. If you don't see that, you can search for it in the search bar. And that takes us to this storage accounts page. So all access to Azure Storage is going to take place through a storage account. So if you're using Blob Storage or Azure Tables or Azure Queues, these are all different sub-services, but they all fall under the domain of a storage account. So we're going to create a storage account now using the create button. That's going to take us to this form. So one of the things here is the resource group. Make sure that you add that to the resource group that we just created called Django Web App. And you need to give the storage account a name, and this must be unique across all storage account names in Microsoft Azure. So I'm going to paste one in here called 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗍 Django Storage. And for performance, you can use the standard one unless you have requirements for a premium version. And you also have some redundancy options. So geo-redundant storage, that's slightly more expensive, but it backs up your data in different regions. Whereas locally redundant storage, that's the recommended type for non-critical scenarios. I'm going to select that. That's all we need in this video. And then once we've done that, we can create our storage account by clicking the button at the bottom. That's going to validate that. And then after validation, we can hit the create button. As you can see at the top right, that deploys this storage account. So that's in progress at the moment. What we're going to do is we're going to copy the name of the storage account. And I'm going to go back to VS Code. And within this project, we have the example.env file. I'm going to create a .env file from that. So let's go to the terminal here. And I'm going to clear the terminal out. And what we're going to do is copy .env.example to a .env file. And that's going to copy the keys from the example file into this. And then we can set the properties in this. So the Azure account name, that relates to the name of the storage account. We're going to set that to 𝗵𝗽𝗀𝗍 Django Storage. And we'll go back to the other two in a second. Let's go to the portal, and we can see that the deployment of this storage account is complete. We can now go to this resource, and we have that open here. And this is the container for our storage account. If we go to the left-hand sidebar, I'm going to go down to the Security and Networking tab, and we can go to the section on Access Keys. And what I'm going to do here is copy one of these two keys that are provided. So let's do the first one at the top here. I'm going to copy this key and we're going to go back to the VS Code project. And for the Azure account key, I'm going to paste that key into that variable. And we can now create the Azure Blob Container. Let's go back to the portal and I'm going to scroll up here and it's this section on data storage. Now Azure storage accounts, you can create multiple different storage types. The one we're interested for our Django application is containers. So let's click that. And we're going to add a new container using this button at the top left. And we'll give that a very simple name called Django Container. And notice anonymous access level here. This setting specifies whether data in the container might be accessed anonymously. And by default, this container data is private to the account owner. Now at the moment we can't change this setting because anonymous access is disabled on the storage account. We'll see an example of how to change that at the end of the video, but for now let's create our new container. And as you can see, that's called Django-container. So I'm going to go back to VS Code and we have one more setting here. So I'm going to set Azure Container to that Django container value. So these are secure variable names, and particularly the account key must not be committed to GitHub. What we're now going to do is we're going to read these into our Django settings, and we're going to use Django-environ to do that. So let's go to settings.py, and I'm going to scroll to the top here. And what we need to do is install Django-environ. So to start with, I'm going to go to the documentation. And I'll leave a link to the documentation for Django-environ below the video. This is a package that allows you to use the 12-factor methodology to configure your Django app using environment variables. So let's go to the quick start section on the left-hand side, and we're going to copy some of these values here. So let's start by importing the package at the top of our Django settings.py file. And then we're going to paste a couple of lines of code in here. We're going to set up an environment object. So let's go back here and just underneath the base directory, we'll do that. And then the only other thing we need to do in settings.py is read the values from the environment file by pointing Django-environ to that file. So I'm going to copy this and we're going to paste that into our settings. Now we haven't imported the OS module, but we have a base directory, and that's a pathlib.path object in Python. And we can reference a property, or rather we can reference a file in that directory using this syntax here. So what we're doing here is we import environ and we set up an environment object. And then we use the environ readIn function to read in the values from that environment file. Now once we've done that, I'm going to go to the bottom of this file and I'm going to paste in these lines of code here. So we're setting the settings here for Azure Container, account name and account key by reading them in from the environment using that env object. So that's going to get these from this .env file and read them into the settings, and that's what we need in order to actually connect to that storage container and to use this Azure storage class from Django-storages. So let's now move on. On the terminal, I'm just going to make sure everything is up and running. And by the way, if you haven't already done so, make sure you have installed Django-environ. So we can use pip install Django-environ to do that. And I already have it installed in the virtual environment. Let's clear the terminal. And now we're going to actually allow a user to upload a file and save that data to this file upload model. So we're going to create a Django form that allows the user to upload a file, and that's going to be a model form, and it's going to be centered around the file upload model. So let's create a class here called file upload form within forms.py, and that's going to inherit from the forms.modelForm class. And in that class, we define a meta class, and the model we're linking it to is file upload, and we only want one field on that model, and that's the file field. So if we look at models.py, we're going to dynamically link the upload to a user within the Django view. The file itself is what we are going to upload, so we need that field in the form. And then this is automatically set by the database when we save the record. So we don't need to do anything with that. We only need one field in this form. Now we need to actually render the form on a page, so let's go to views.py, and we have a very simple Django view here. Now because we want to associate the upload with a user, we're going to protect the view with the login_required decorator, and we need to import that at the top. So I'm going to do that at the top here from Django.contrib.auth.decorators. Now what we're going to do if it's a GET request is just add a context dictionary here with a key called form, and we're going to instantiate the form that we created here, and that's the file upload form. So what I'm going to do is import that form into the views.py file. So from forms, let's import the file upload form, and we can instantiate that here in this key and that's going to add it to the context, and it's going to make it available in index.html. So we're going to go to index.html, that's a template in the core/templates directory. And if we go in here, we're going to remove this h1 tag. And for now, I'm just going to render the form out, and we're going to do that using divs. Now let's test this out for now. We're going to run the Django development server, and we're going to go to the browser, and we're going to navigate to that page. Now we're getting a 404 not found, and that's because we're not logged in. And in order to log in, what I've done is create a Django super user, and that has the username of admin. We can log into the Django admin with this super user, and then we can navigate back to the main page of the application, and you can see that field for uploading the file. So that's not very useful at the moment. We don't really have a way of submitting this data. So we're going to add some code to that in a second. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to minimize the terminal, and I'm going to paste some different code in here. So let me do that now. We're creating a div with the class of container, and now we have a form element in the HTML, and the submission of the form is going to be a post request. And importantly, we're adding the enc type, and that stands for encoding type, and we're setting that to multipart/form data. Now this attribute is very important if you're uploading a file through an HTML form. Make sure to set the encoding type using this attribute. Now because the submission is a post request, also make sure to add the CSRF token. And then we've moved the form.asDiv call into this form element. And finally, we have a button that allows us to submit the form. So let's go back to the page and refresh. And we now have the submit button. Everything else is the same. And we're not going to change the styles here because this is not about the CSS. Obviously, you wouldn't deploy a website that looks like that. But for now, what's going to happen is that when we submit the form, nothing is going to happen, because if we go back to views.py, this is only going to reinstantiate a context and return the same template with that context to the client. Now what we actually need to do here is handle the case when the request.method is a post request. So let's do that now. If request.method is post, we're going to create the form, and in order to create the form, we instantiate it as we did before, but this time we're going to pass some extra data into the form that's coming from the client when it's submitted. So request.post will be the first argument, and then also request.files. We need to pass request.files because we know that a file is going to be submitted in this form. So .post and .files, these are two attributes on the Django request object, and they capture the submitted data, so we pass them into the file upload form. Once we've done that, when we have the form, we can check if the form is valid using form.isValid, and that's a function. If it's valid, we can then process the form. So I'm going to create a variable called upload, and we're going to call form.save and pass commit equals false. Now model forms, when you call .save, it's going to try and save that to the database unless you pass commit equals false. And that's what we're going to do here, because when we save the file upload, if we go back to models.py, we don't want to save this with just the file because we want to also associate a user with the file upload. So let's do that now. After we've got the object back here, we can set the user on that. So upload.user is going to be equal to request.user. And we know we've got a logged in user because we're using the login required decorator. So once we've associated the user with the upload, we can then call the .save method to save that to the database. And finally, just for simplicity, I'm going to return a redirect back to the home page. Now we need to import redirect at the top, so we can do that from Django.shortcuts. Now what if the form is not valid? We can add an else clause here and handle that. And what we're going to put in here is very similar to the GET request case. So I'm going to paste these two lines of code. And what we're actually going to change though is what the form key is set to. So rather than instantiating a new form, we can pass in the form that has the errors by referencing that form here. So remember, form.isValid returned false. That means there's errors, and we're going to hit this else block. And we want to add that form to the context so that we can see the form with all the errors. So let's try this out. And the important thing from the perspective of Azure is that when we save the uploaded file data is going to be present in the model in the file field here. And that's going to be sent to Azure Blob Storage because in settings.py, we've set the default storage backend to Azure Storage. And on top of that, we've read in the connection information and the blob storage or the container information from the environment using these environment variables. Let's now test it out. We're going to go back to the browser and I'm going to refresh this page. And I'm going to choose a file that's in my local directory. So I have a cities.csv file here, and this just contains some information about cities in the world. The information itself is not important. Let's try submitting this. And when we submit that, you can see the request is in flight. And after we submit that, we're redirected back to the page. And that you can see that here in the view, we're redirecting back. So what we're going to do now is check that the file has been uploaded to Azure, to that container and blob storage. So let's do that now. We're going to go to the portal and we're going to go back to Microsoft Azure's storage account. So this is the storage account we configured earlier on. We're going to go to the containers and we're going to find the Django container that we created. And notice now we have a directory here called uploads. And if we look in that, we get a file called 𝗬𝗠𝗲𝗍. So this process has now worked. We have a form that we created with Django, and that form is being rendered in a template. And when we upload the form on this page, it's sending that form to our Azure container and storing it securely and reliably on the cloud. I want to go to the Django admin UI, so let's go to /admin. And we registered the file upload model with the admin, so let's go and have a look at this now. And you can see here it's associated with the admin user that I'm logged in as. And we also have the file below. Now this linking of the user to the file, that's something you're going to commonly want to do if you're allowing users to upload files to different locations. You want to know which user actually owns the file or which user has uploaded the file. So you can create that link in your models by adding that kind of foreign key between the two entities. Now one thing to note, if we click the link here in the Django admin to the file, that's going to actually download the file. I don't know if you've seen that at the top right here. We have a download history and it contains the file that we have uploaded to Azure Blob Storage. So through the admin UI or through the templates that you have in your application, you can reference these files that are stored on Blob Storage and you can then show them to users or allow users to download them. Now what I want to do to finish the video is go back to this page here, and underneath the form, I want to show a list of all of the logged in users' files that they've uploaded. So let's go back to the Django page here, and what we're going to do is just keep this simple and add this to the context on a GET request. So I'm going to split this into a couple of lines here. So as well as the form, we're going to add another key to the context called files. And in order to do this, we need to get an access to the file upload model. So let's import that at the top and then go back down to the context dictionary. We're going to paste the name of the model and we're going to perform a function here, and it's fileupload.objects.filter. And we want to get the uploads that are associated with the logged in user. So we're going to filter on the user field, and we're going to get back those files that belong to the user. And we can get the logged in user on the request.user property. Once we've got the files in the context dictionary, we can then reference them in index.html. So just below this form here, I'm going to create another div and I'm going to give that an ID of files, and we can close that off at the bottom. And what we're then going to do is we're going to create a template for loop here. And for each file in the list of files, what we're going to do is we're going to render them out using an anchor tag. So let's create the anchor tag, and it's the href property that we're interested in here. We're going to refer to the file, and the name of the field that was on that model was also file. And it was the URL of the object that we want to get back here and display in the href. And I'm just going to give some hard-coded text here of view. So just to explain this file.file, each one of these files that's coming into the template is an instance of this model class here. And for each model, there is a field on the model called file. So that explains why we're referencing that here. And a file field in Django has a property called .url. So if you need to get a link to that file, you can do it through the URL property. So let's save this and go back to the page. When I refresh this page, you can see we have a single link here. And that's because we only uploaded a single file at the moment to Azure Blob Storage. If I click view, again, that's going to download the file at the top right. So this gives your users access to the files that have been uploaded to Blob Storage. Now let me quickly upload another file. And I'm actually just going to upload the .getignore file for this project. Let's submit that. And you can see now we have a second link appearing on the page. So there are two files now associated with the logged in user, and they are being displayed on the page, albeit in one of the worst UIs you've probably ever seen. Now let's finish the video with a couple of different concepts here. I'm going to go back to settings.py and to the storages setting. And we set the expiration seconds here to 500 seconds. What I'm actually going to do is comment that out, and let's assume that we are not setting this variable in this setting. If we go back to the Django-storages documentation, let's look at the expiration seconds value. What this means is the number of seconds before a URL expires. And if we set that to none, that means that the URL is never going to expire. And notice that the default value is none. So when I comment this out, that means it's going to go to none by default. And as it says here, that means it's never going to expire. Now this is important. Be aware that the container must have public read permissions in order to access a URL that does not have an expiry date. Now these kind of configurations can trip you up, so I'm going to explain this and we're going to walk through the example of what this means. Now that we've commented out expiration seconds, that means that our URLs are never going to expire. So let's go back to the application and I'm going to refresh the page and let's click one of these links. And this time we get a different message. We don't get the file being downloaded. Instead, we have a public access not permitted exception. So basically what this is telling me is that public access is not permitted on this Azure storage account. And that conforms with what the documentation said. A container must have public read permissions in order to access a URL that does not have an expiration date. So let's go back to Azure, and if you need your objects or your files to have public access, and you don't care about expiring URLs, then you can set that on the storage account and on the container. So let's start with the storage account. What we're going to do is go back to this page here. This is our storage account. It's called Bug Bytes Django Storage. And we're going to go to the overview at the top and click that. Now, in order to turn on public access, what we can do is go down to these properties. And there's a section here, or there's a variable called blob anonymous access, and currently that's disabled. Now I'm going to click on that, and if you need to enable public access, what you can do is you can change that from disabled to enabled. Once you've done that, click save, and that's going to apply that new setting, and you can see that that's successfully updated. So now that we've turned on public access on the storage account, that means that we can set this public access on the different types of data storage that we're using. So let's go back to containers, and we're going to go to the Django container that we were working with. And there's a section here called change access level. So if you need to change the access level of a particular container, you can do it here. Now you can see that this is grayed out at the moment, and it says that anonymous access to the container is being blocked because it's disabled on the storage account. So I think it takes a little bit of time for that change we just made to be applied. So what I'm going to do is just refresh this page, and hopefully that setting or that change is going to be applied when we hit change access level again. And you can see now that is no longer grayed out. So we're going to change this from private with no anonymous access to the blob setting here. And this is going to allow anonymous read access for blobs only. Let's do that now and set that to OK. And that successfully changes the access level for the containers. We can now go back to our Django application, and that was here. Let's go back to this page, and this time when we hit view, again it's going to download the file, and that's because public access is now permitted. So if you need that public access, you can do that on your Azure storage account. What I'm going to do is change this back though, because that's generally not what we want in a Django application if you want to secure user uploaded data. And this is all contextual, depends on what you're actually developing and what kind of application you have. What I'm going to do is change it back to private only. So we've done that on the container. Let's go back to the storage account now. And on the overview page, we can go back down to this anonymous access setting. And we're going to set that to disabled again and save this configuration. So for security, unless you have a good reason to turn public access on, you should keep your objects in your blob storage containers private. Now we can finish by looking at expiration seconds in a bit more detail. So let's set that to a value that's very small. Let's say 10 seconds until the URL expires. If we save that value and go back to our Django application and refresh this page, that means it's going to generate some URLs for these objects. And I can click view here and it's going to download that file, as you can see at the top right. But after 10 seconds, that URL that is generated for this object, that is going to expire, and that means we're going to get an error when we try and download this file after that expiration time. So let's click view now, and you can see again we're getting authentication failed this time, and the server has failed to authenticate the request. And if we look at the details of this error, we can see that the signed expiry time must be after the signed start time. So the URL for this object in Blob Storage has now expired, and that means that you can protect the URLs that you're sharing in your applications. So rather than having a URL that never changes, if you set this expiration time and keep your objects private, what that means is that you can generate these URLs and you can share them with people internally on the application. But if someone copies that and pastes it all over the internet, that's not going to compromise the data in Azure Blob Storage, because these people might be sharing the URL, but it's going to expire after a given time period. And as soon as it expires, the link that they've been pasting all over the internet becomes redundant, becomes irrelevant, and all is well in your application. Now, depending on what you're developing, you can set this to whatever value you want. 10 seconds is probably too small a value, I would say, for almost all applications. But you can set that to something like, let's say, 1,000 seconds, and that's going to very quickly expire in the grand scheme of things, and it's going to prevent your objects being shared across the internet. So that's all for this video. We've seen how to use Django-storages with Microsoft Azure as a storage backend, and we've also seen how this expiration seconds value works in order to configure URLs that expire after a certain period of time. And we also saw how seamlessly this Django-storages backend works with Django's file fields, and we saw how when we submit a form we can upload the files to Azure Blob Storage, and also how we can retrieve files from storage and download them within our applications. So thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for much more Azure and Django material. And if this content was useful, consider buying the channel a coffee. We've got a link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.